Hello and welcome back to my IDW Retrospective series. Today we're on part 6 and we're looking at the second batch of Spotlight issues. Both new and familiar faces get some time to shine in the 4 stories covered in this video, and they're all welcome additions. From Soundwave's clash with Bludgeon on Earth in 1984, to Optimus Prime still reeling from revelations gleaned at the end of Escalation, these issues, released in March, April, July, and August of 2007, expand the IDW continuity in significant ways. This clutch of spotlights also sees the creative team expand as well, with Nick Roche taking on writing duties for Spotlight Cup, the first published issue in the 05 continuity not written by Simon Furman, excluding Hearts of Steel, which again was originally devised as occupying a separate continuity before being folded into the main continuity much later. There's a lot to talk about here, but before we get started, I want to note that normally I would have included Spotlight Ramjet in a Spotlight Volume 2 video, as that's how IDW collected them in trade paperback form, but I think that issue makes the most sense being discussed alongside New Avengers Transformers, so I chose to omit it here in favor of covering it in a later video. Plus, it just makes more sense in terms of placement, and it'll still fit nicely into my modified publishing order that I'm covering these stories in. As before, I'll give a synopsis and some brief notes or observations for each issue, and then go into more depth with a review and analysis for everything at the end. So with all of that out of the way, let's dive into these issues, starting with Soundwave. Spotlight Soundwave is deeply connected to Spotlight Shockwave and Stormbringer, fleshing out events that were hinted at or suggested to happen off-panel. If you recall, during the epilogue of Spotlight Shockwave, after Shockwave's disappearance, Megatron tasks Bludgeon with sifting through all of the Decepticon scientist projects, which we know led to Bludgeon uncovering Or-13 and using it to revive Thunderwing in the pages of Stormbringer. Spotlight Soundwave reveals the specifics on how all this went down. This issue once again shows the conversation between Megatron and Bludgeon, albeit with Megatron's helmet being miscolored to its typical gray from the ongoing rather than the black helmet that had been used in Stormbringer and Spotlight Shockwave. But there's something more here beyond visual inconsistency. After Bludgeon leaves Megatron's chambers, we see that Megatron assigns Soundwave to keep tabs on Bludgeon. These Decepticons are a suspicious and paranoid bunch, aren't they? Not that there isn't good reason for that. Shockwave was pursuing his own rogue agenda after all, which in turn fuels Bludgeon's apocalyptic ambitions which seem to briefly ignite Soundwave's own opportunistic schemes and self-serving interests. So I guess it makes sense why they're so paranoid and untrusting. As Bludgeon uncovers Regenesis among Shockwave's projects, he keeps his findings secret, unaware that Soundwave is spying on his data collection. Soundwave, however, also keeps Bludgeon's findings a secret, waiting to see if this mysterious project could personally benefit him before sharing the information with Megatron. Soundwave observes as Bludgeon and his soldiers set up shop in Shockwave's old underground lab, the one shown in Stormbringer. Then sometime later, they recover something from the depths of Cybertron and keep it under a tight lock and key. That something is unknown to Soundwave, but clear to readers who have read Stormbringer. This was the body of the inactive Thunderwing that they would soon power up with Ultra Energon. The timeline's a little slippery on all of this, but I think some of these events must have happened after the planet-wide exodus, though I suppose some of Bludgeon's efforts could have occurred in the time frame between the initial confrontation with Thunderwing and both factions abandoning Cybertron. Regardless, by 1984, Bludgeon and his lackeys are on Earth, enacting their plan to recover Or-13 with Soundwave in pursuit. After tracking down facsimiles made by Bludgeon, who are posing as the foremen of a team constructing a surveying shaft of some kind, Soundwave disguises himself in his iconic alt mode, where we first see him blaring a tune that seems to be a few lines of Van Halen's 1984 hit Jump, jumbled up and or mashed together into nonsense, potentially to be just suggestive enough of the song while avoiding copyright infringement. with the actual line from the song "You Gotta Roll with the Punches" changed to "Gotta Roll Out Now," a winking nod to Optimus Prime's rallying cry. Undercover in his tape deck mode, Soundwave gathers intel, secretly observing the facsimile's conversations, later making use of Ravage and Laserbeak to discover Bludgeon's lair, nestled deep inside Mount St. Helens, the real-life volcano that erupted in 1980, an event that was incorporated into the Transformers origin story with the fictional volcano Mount St. Hilary for the G1 cartoon and Marvel comic in 1984. Inside Mount St. Helens, we learn that these facsimiles, named Fleming and Markham, are given their final mission to discreetly place and detonate Decepticon charges near a pocket of natural gas in order to evacuate the site and surrounding area, giving the Decepticons time and space to collect Ore-13. After Laserbeak relays the specifics of Bludgeon's plan to Soundwave, the Decepticon, intent on keeping his presence on Earth concealed, stages an abduction where Laserbeak snatches Soundwave in tape deck mode away from his owner, one of the workers on the site. Soundwave then infiltrates Bludgeon's base, waiting for the rogue Decepticons by the time they return with their haul of Ultra Energon. Soundwave proposes an alliance of mutual interest, but soon discovers that Bludgeon and his followers are not acting out of a desire for material enrichment, but instead to revive Thunderwing so that he might pass judgment on the entire universe. And here, something changes in Soundwave. Seeing the big picture and terrible implications of Bludgeon's goal, Soundwave's priorities shift from self-serving to self-sacrificing, challenging his fellow Decepticons with the help of Ravage and Laserbeak. Bludgeon dispatches both Laserbeak and Ravage with ease, leaving Soundwave on his own with Iguanus bearing down on him with one of Shockwave's experimental weapons. Realizing he's outnumbered and can't win on his own, Soundwave tries to fire on the harvested Ore-13, hoping to detonate it and kill all the occupants in the base. But Iguanus is faster on the draw, opening fire and revealing what the experimental weapon does. It overrides a Cybertronian's transformation cog, forcing them to transform and locking them in that mode, which, needless to say, is fairly bad news for Soundwave considering the severe limitations of his 1980s Earth alt mode. Bludgeon uses a plasma density charge to trigger an eruption in Mount St. Helens, burying their makeshift base along with Soundwave, Ravage, and Laserbeak. In 1985, Joshua Red, the man we first saw in the retrospective video for Escalation, oversees a Skywatch team digging Laserbeak out of the rubble, musing that this acquisition will finally provide Skywatch with the funding it needs. But there's a second epilogue in Spotlight Soundwave, jumping forward to the year 2007, where two kids are looking over vintage equipment, and one in particular has his eye on a tape deck with a Decepticon logo plastered on the cassette door. And with the conclusion of Spotlight Soundwave, we've now seen all of the payoff for the foreshadowing from Escalation number 1, with Optimus Prime revealing that there was record of Soundwave on Earth. We've also got the rest of the payoff for the world building in Infiltration number 1, with the close-up of Hunter O'Nien's laptop screen, dropping hints about the Eureka, Nevada dig site and dinosaur variant mechanoids seen in Spotlight Shockwave and Escalation number 5, and foreshadowing Spotlight Soundwave by mentioning the Mount St. Helens eruption exhibits. But that wraps up the Soundwave issue. The next one we'll be looking at is Spotlight Cup. As mentioned previously, this issue was notable for being the first Spotlight in the 05 continuity to be written by someone other than Simon Furman, with Nick Roche taking a crack at both the art and writing. It was also unique among the rest of the Spotlights in that it was self-contained and didn't play into the main story being told by Furman, although details and events of Spotlight Cup would be revisited and picked up later on in the continuity. As you may already know, G1 Cup was part of the 1986 line of toys and made his first appearance in Transformers Fiction in the animated film from the same year, a source this issue pays homage to with the opening blurb on the inside cover, referencing some of the stories he told during the film, saying he's fought Igyax, fended off the Shrike Bats of Dromedon, and remembers the day they inverted polarities. But how will the grizzled Autobot veteran Cup fare against this latest challenge? Zombots. This issue was Cup's first appearance in this continuity, and IDW really put this character through hell over the years, and it all started here. The bulk of this issue takes place on an alien world overgrown with gigantic crystals. Interestingly enough, the Season 3 episode Chaos features a story involving Cup and some crystals as well, where Cup is imprisoned with other mechanoids on the planet Dread and forced to mine death crystals. But really though, the only connecting piece here is the crystals themselves, so it wouldn't be all that surprising if it was just a coincidence. The story begins with a mechanoid alien crashing on the planet and is quickly met by Cup. Although the alien pleads for help, the Autobot wordlessly beats the mechanoid to death, decapitating him and tossing his head in a lake. So yeah, right away it becomes fairly obvious that 1, something is not right here, and 2, this story is gonna be a bit darker than you might have been expecting. The specifics of the story largely unfold through Cup's narration. We learn that Cup and his crew of Autobots crashed on the planet some time ago, although Cup isn't sure how long, and the chances of rescue seem remote. Although that doesn't seem to bother Cup too much, all he really cares about is how the crystal formations dotting the planet make him feel when they, sing to him, making him forget about all his problems. At this point, something definitely seems off with Cup, and that's made even more apparent when he returns to his makeshift shelter, where inside, Cup has propped up the half-obliterated corpse of Outback and begins speaking to the dead Autobot as if he was still alive, even imagining in his mind that Outback is cracking jokes. Oh, and that blunt instrument he used to kill the mechanoid alien earlier? Yeah, that was one of Outback's arms, so it seems likely that Cup has completely lost his mind early on in the book, but there are still the specifics to untangle. The entire situation becomes even more bizarre as we learn that Cup is woken up every night, first by a ghost, clearly Springer, saying, "We're coming to get you, Cup. Do you hear me? Stay right there. We're coming for you." And then soon after, Cup finds himself attacked by monsters. Every night he defends himself from these creatures, calling out in vain to Outback for help, killing as many of the adversaries as he can until his overtaxed systems threaten to send him into a critical state of spark core meltdown, an apparently explosive method of demise for Cybertronians. Somehow, Cup always holds on just long enough for his attackers to retreat, and then in the morning he wakes to the sound of the music of the crystals and repeats the same pattern over again. As we eventually see, what's actually going on here is that Cup has gone completely mad. The crystals are radioactive and have some kind of disturbing psychedelic effect on his mind, eroding his sense of reality. The ghost of Springer is actually Springer, very much alive and transmitting his holographic messages through the deceased Outback's holo emitter, and the monsters attacking him at night are actually Autobots clad in anti-radiation armor. Although Cup gave up on any kind of rescue, the Autobots didn't give up on him and have been trying to rescue him this whole time, meaning Cup, in his delirium, has been killing his allies who were just trying to save him. We learn all of this as Siren, the only survivor of the latest rescue attempt, orbital jumps back to Arc 17 to vent his frustrations and chastise Springer for the nature of and intent behind this mission. The Autobots can't use weapons because the crystals are extremely volatile and explosive, and they keep hitting a point where they have to stop pursuing Cup every night so they don't trigger his spark core meltdown, which would also detonate the crystals, so they appear to be at an impasse. Despite everything, Springer refuses to give up on Cup, even in the face of protests from those acting under his orders and even Prowl himself. As Prowl says of the old Autobot, "He's lived his life, Springer, let him go." But Springer refuses, calling in a specialist for one more rescue attempt. That specialist, Trailbreaker, also making his first IDW appearance, is able to prevent Cup's spark from melting down by using a localized version of his force field, which allows the Autobots to finally extract their target. However, Cup's components are so old that modern tech upgrades won't work with his antiquated mechanisms, meaning Cup's body cannot be easily repaired, and his mind, as Springer points out, may never heal. And that's how the issue ends, with Cup existing in a kind of living death, and Springer reflecting on his decisions, wondering if it was all worth it. The next issue, Spotlight Galvatron, turns up the heat on the Dead Universe story elements that were simmering in the background since being introduced in Spotlight Nightbeat. The issue kicks off with Galvatron, emissary of the Dead Universe, emerging from an anomaly within the Benzuli expanse, tasked with two objectives, one of which is to interrupt the investigations of the anomaly being conducted by a ship crewed by an unidentified alien race, an undertaking that appears to lead to Galvatron's swift death as the aliens blast him with their ship's barrage armaments normally used to destroy comets. With their attacker seemingly killed, the aliens pull the remains aboard for an examination, only for Galvatron to pop back up and proceed to kill the aliens and blow up the ship, accomplishing his secondary objective with ease, moving on to his primary objective. That objective will eventually lead him to Cybertron, to Thunderhead Pass specifically, the infamous locale featured prominently in Stormbringer, where the Autobots have now set up a contained environmental safe zone to block out the deadly hazards of the wasteland that Cybertron has become. Hound is in charge of a small unit here consisting of Sideswipe, Warpath, Leadfoot, Scram, and Road Rocket. We meet Sideswipe for the first time in the IDW continuity in the process of violating Hound's communication embargo to put in a transmission to Ark 19, looking to speak to Optimus Prime to request transfer to Earth to help in the search for Sunstreaker. Sideswipe is a bit of an action junkie here and is dissatisfied with his post at Thunderhead Pass, feeling like he could be put to better use than babysitting stasis-locked Decepticons, as he puts it, and we get the sense that he's been impatiently trying to convince Optimus to grant his request for a while now. However, he's only able to lodge a complaint with Ratchet as Optimus is away on personal business, the specifics of which we'll see shortly when we get to Spotlight Optimus Prime. Cutting the transmission short, Hound reprimands Sideswipe in front of the rest of his unit, not that Sideswipe seems to really care, and tells him to relieve Leadfoot for guard duty. By the time Sideswipe finds Leadfoot, however, Galvatron has killed him with only a touch, sucking the life out of him and causing him to deteriorate. Although we'll see this again later on, we've technically already seen it before in Spotlight Nightbeat, where the Autobot detective from that story noted that a similar thing happened to the mechanoid mercenary Kraken. Anyway, Sideswipe doesn't hesitate in responding to the attack, making use of his infamous but sparingly used rocket pack, which he uses here to deliver a high-velocity punch to Galvatron's face. Galvatron soon finds himself under assault by the rest of Hound's unit, and although Hound wants him alive for questioning, Sideswipe sets his blaster to head explosion and pulverizes Galvatron's face, popping a mechanical eyeball out of his skull, and the mysterious intruder collapses to the ground, dead. Or at least, it seems that way. I like how Furman and Guidi handled this because earlier in the issue, there could have been a question of whether or not the aliens actually killed Galvatron, or if he was just playing possum. But here we see evidence that Galvatron is capable of reviving from seemingly fatal injuries. Galvatron transforms to cannon mode and incapacitates the Autobots, making a point to leave them alive despite his orders to kill them all. This is a small act of rebellion to Galvatron, an assurance that he is in control of his destiny, despite being deeply in servitude to an unknown master who commands something known as the Darkness. As he narrates throughout the book, he is an emissary, a harbinger, forced to do another's bidding while chafing against that authority, mirroring in some ways the character's relationship to Unicron in the G1 movie, where Galvatron would look for little ways to assert his autonomy as he worked towards freeing himself from the shackles of his servitude. Still, his rebellious streak doesn't prevent Galvatron from completing his primary objective for his master, namely securing the stasis-locked remains of Thunderwing. In this Spotlight issue, we learn that Galvatron was aboard the first Ark and part of the expedition team that departed from ancient Cybertron to chart the Benzuli expanse. We also see some other members of the crew two of which are reminiscent of pre-existing characters thanks to their color schemes more than their designs. Though the one on the right is similar to G1 Thunderwing in some ways in terms of design, it's mostly the color scheme that reminds me of the Decepticon scientist. And the one on the left seems to possibly be a fake-out character, deliberately evoking design elements and a color scheme shared amongst many primes and convoys throughout several different continuities, potentially to trick readers into thinking this might be the Prime Galvatron mentioned that led the expedition. But neither of these characters are important in the slightest, or even named for that matter. The specifics of the important members of the crew will be revealed later, and these guys don't make the cut. They're placed in the frame as if they might be important, but they're really not, and we never see them again. So it seems like these two were just added here to keep readers guessing, to build the suspense, or just as little Easter eggs. It's also revealed that it was Galvatron who doomed the first Ark, sending the ship into the anomaly at the Benzuli Expanse, sensing power and destiny on the other side of the event horizon, and in the process killing himself and all the crew as they entered the dead universe. As much as anything can die once it enters the dead universe, that is. Anyway, I like this character moment for Galvatron, making it seem like he betrayed the entire crew and the expedition itself for his own gains. But unfortunately, this moment would be retconned during Dark Cybertron, instead showing that Galvatron was acting under orders. In this issue, Galvatron also mentions Prime and the Matrix, hinting at the lineage that would soon be revealed, but stops short of naming this Prime or the master he now serves, no doubt an attempt to keep some secrecy and intrigue as the plot involving the Dead Universe unfolds. We won't have to wait long, however, as in the next Spotlight issue, we'll learn more about this particular Prime and his connection to the first Ark. Speaking of, let's take a look at that now, turning our attention to Spotlight Optimus Prime, the last Spotlight issue we'll be taking a look at in this video. Much like Galvatron's Spotlight, this book helps set the stage for future plot lines revolving around the Dead Universe and, as previously mentioned, explains some specifics about the expedition of the first Ark in the process. This Spotlight takes place soon after the conclusion of Escalation, with Optimus distracted and unable to focus after his encounter with the mysterious presence in the limbo of infraspace. In a sequence similar to the one in Escalation, reports stream in from a variety of sources, with two, the one from Springer and Hound, serving as nods to the recently released Spotlight issues for Cup and Galvatron, and one from Wheelie foreshadowing the upcoming Spotlight for the diminutive Autobot Survivalist, and one from Ultra Magnus that brings to mind the duly appointed enforcer of the Tyrest Accords Spotlight issue, but I think is also included to keep Scorponok's name fresh in the reader's mind, helping to build up to the Decepticon's reappearance, or perhaps to throw readers off the trail after leaving some hints in Escalation. While this whole sequence is happening, Prowl is also at Prime's side, divulging every report the Autobot commander might need to know, but the constant streams of data and managerial tasks of leadership can't shake Prime out of his ruminations on his mystical experience in Brosnia. So he simply leaves, departing Earth for answers, turning to the only bot he can for counsel, Omega Supreme. The massive Omega Sentinel lives in isolation in deep space aboard a cloaked artificial asteroid housed within a nebula. So yeah, he's a little antisocial, I guess. Anyway, Optimus asks Supreme to share any knowledge he has about the first Ark and the Prime that led the expedition, named here as Nova Prime. Optimus began to suspect that the presence he felt in infraspace was Nova, only that he had been, as he says, changed beyond all recognition. The ancient Omega Supreme knew Nova Prime and, what's more, harbored disagreements with the Prime over how Cybertron should grow. As you might expect from a guy who builds a house out of an asteroid in a remote nebula, Omega Supreme believed Cybertronians should strive for isolation and contemplation, fostering inner growth. but isolation and contemplation are not dramatic and threatening enough words to be part of the Asians era, which, as an aside, maybe would have been called the Shuns era due to Furman's plan to cap the whole thing off with a planned but abandoned series titled Transformers Expansion. But seeing as how Expansion was never released, Asians seems more than appropriate. That term, expansion, had been in rotation in this continuity since Spotlight Nightbeat and appeared in Spotlight Galvatron as well as Spotlight Optimus Prime, so clearly Furman intended to see the concept through in some fashion. Eventually, we'll learn that expansion has some additional sinister connotations, but here in this Spotlight issue, it's used to denote Nova Prime's divergence from Omega Supreme's philosophy. Whereas Omega sought spiritual growth, Nova wanted literal growth to expand Cybertronian influence and power beyond their homeworld, conquering other planets and civilizations that Nova believed to be inferior. The pretense of exploration and trade attributed to the voyage of the first Ark was a lie, concealing Nova's imperialist tendencies and thus allowing the crew of the first Ark to be remembered as heroes throughout history. This insight casts a shadow over Optimus Prime's notion of Nova Prime and even the lineage of the Primes in its entirety. There's little time to dig deeper into the fate of the first Ark, however, as Omega Supreme's asteroid is attacked. The Omega Guardian was being hunted by 6 Cybertronians with a grudge, and they finally located him. Perhaps because Optimus inadvertently led them to Omega's doorstep, but it's not stated explicitly. Regardless, what comes next is one of the coolest moments in the entire 05 IDW continuity, as the 6 Cybertronians, Scowl, Bristleback, Wildfly, Icepick, Birdbrain, and Slog, smash into Omega's chambers in their combined form of Monstructor. This is an oft-overlooked combiner team from later on in the franchise. The last combiner to be released in the G1 era in 1989, in fact. You can kind of tell it was later on in the line due to the names of the individual members, which are not the best names in the franchise. When you've got characters named Birdbrain and Slog, you can kind of tell there's not much left in the tank. Though, contradicting what I just said, Monstructor is actually a pretty decent name, so I suppose there were still some good names floating around out there among those that had to be scraped off the bottom of the barrel. The team was known as the Pretender Monsters because the original toys could be plugged into an even more stripped down and basic Pretender shell than the standard Pretenders. So pretty cool that this fairly obscure team was selected, but Monstructor's appearance in Spotlight Optimus Prime was significant beyond just being an unexpected or interesting character pick, as this marks the first time in this continuity that an actual combiner was featured, or gestalt as we call them back in those heady early days of the online fandom, a term I rarely use anymore. Old habits die hard, but I've really come around on the term combiner. It just rolls off the tongue a bit easier, I think. It's funny though, because Furman even uses the term gestalt in this issue, which makes sense as we were still years away from combiner becoming the go-to parlance. But it's also revealed here that the 6 Cybertronians' ability to combine is unique and singularly relegated to this group. So this is the only combiner at this point, and Monstructor is a product of an experiment by G-Axis. Information Omega Supreme just casually tosses out when telling Optimus about the group, introducing by name only the IDW version of the at the time shiny new antagonist of the totally rad 90s Generation 2 comic published by Marvel. Here we learn that G-Axis was Nova Prime's chief theoretical strategist, placing him in Monstructor firmly in the time period of the first arc. Anyway, the Monstructor 6, as they will soon be called, are after revenge. After Nova Prime and G-Axis left aboard the first Ark, Omega Supreme, believing the combiner to be an abomination, subdued Monstructor and locked the Monstructor 6 away in something he refers to as a dimensionally displaced prison, where they stayed until recently, apparently. I have to say, either Monstructor is riding high on pure rage, or Omega's gotten sloppy, because it's kind kinda hard to believe he could ever beat Monstructor based off his performance in this issue. He thoroughly gets his ass handed to him by Monstructor, who tears off Omega's arm cannon and drops a combiner-sized shuttle on his face and then the rest of his body. So yeah, tough fella, this Monstructor, pert near invincible, forcing Optimus Prime to improvise, blowing open a set of cargo bay doors, sucking the combatants out into space. Omega nabs Prime and manages to land on a comet, where he divulges some information about Monstructor, including the Combiner's weak point. Prime, disgusted with Omega Supreme's choice to imprison the Monstructor 6, attempts to reason with the fast-approaching Monstructor, offering help, to which Monstructor goes all King Kong, grabbing Optimus and offers the awesome reply, "If you want to help us, die quickly," forcing Prime's hand, literally, as the Autobot commander punches Monstructor's weak point, forcing the six to separate, crumpling into an unconscious heap. At the end of the issue, Prime calls in backup, which consists of the same background characters we saw in Stormbringer, in a cool little connection to Figueroa's previous outing, and the Autobots assist Omega Supreme and detain the Monstructor 6. Optimus orders Jetfire to try and help the six, but Omega Supreme warns that if the ability to combine were to fall into the hands of the Decepticons, it would spell certain doom, which is certainly foreshadowing, though I think it's safe to say that the reality of what happened later was not what Furman was originally forecasting. Nevertheless, Optimus Prime departs in his ship back towards Earth, considering the new information he's learned about the corruption of the Prime lineage in one of Furman's classic tricks, one I pointed out in Stormbringer, where narration from the beginning of an issue is repeated at the end, allowing it to be seen in a new light or with added context. Here, it may not be repeated verbatim, but the point still lands, as Optimus narrates, "The visible scars will fade, but I know with dire certainty, others never will." Moving on to the review and analysis, this is an interesting set of spotlights for a number of reasons. There's no doubt that Simon Furman is still in the driver's seat in terms of the main story of the continuity, but Spotlight Cup demonstrated that IDW was ready to start branching out and that they were willing to let others play in the sandbox. And that's something that will continue to be apparent for the next couple of videos, and I feel like there's more of an in-depth discussion to be had when we get to those specific instances. But for now, just know that this is the first clear sign that IDW wanted to get some more cooks in the kitchen in terms of the main continuity. And the addition of a new writer helps diversify the feel of the continuity somewhat, but I would say that this collection of spotlights is already fairly interesting, even considering that it's still Furman handling the writing for the bulk of them. And what I mean by that is that there are fairly clear differences in how these books connect to the ongoing story. Although it is undeniably setting up some things for future stories, Spotlight Soundwave feels more tethered to what came before in the IDW continuity, filling in some of the blanks left between Stormbringer, Spotlight Shockwave, and, of course, the Skywatch teaser at the end of Escalation. In contrast, Spotlight Galvatron and Spotlight Optimus Prime feel like they both exist purely for moving the ongoing story forward. And maybe this is just me, but I think those two spotlights read like the next issues following the Escalation arc, as in not at all optional and arguably more essential for keeping up with the main story than any of the previous spotlights to date. And then there's Spotlight Cup, which, while part of the same universe, politely stakes out its own corner of the IDW sandbox, adding to the existing lore and fleshing out the universe without interfering with or impeding the main story in any way. In some ways, I think Cup's Spotlight story is a hint of things to come. It's a much wordier comic than the others in this batch, reminding me of James Roberts' tendency to sometimes pile a ton of text onto a page. It's just interesting to view it as something of a precursor to where the comics would go, while also creating a richer universe at that moment in time. And that gets at the main thing I really dig about these issues, namely how they continue to flesh out and expand this continuity. Spotlight Soundwave does a wonderful job of giving us more time in that sweet spot of Stormbringer and Spotlight Shockwave that I'm very fond of, letting us see more of Bludgeon and his crew before everything went sideways on them in Stormbringer, as well as setting up the character and personality of Soundwave, one of the most iconic iconic Decepticon characters. And the rest of the issues, as I've said, push the continuity forward, introducing new characters, but also starting to shake things up a bit. Spotlight Galvatron is a great example of that, introducing some fairly big names from the G1 era, like Galvatron, obviously, Sideswipe, and Hound into the IDW continuity. Galvatron is pretty much my favorite character from Transformers, and I admittedly have a lot of favorites and beloved characters, but he's always been at the top of the list for me ever since I first saw the 1986 animated movie as a kid. Part of that's down to his design, another part is down to Leonard Nimoy's performance, which I've always liked. Galvatron's just like a more brutal version of Megatron, but Megatron's power-hungry tyrant personality is still in there, peaking when Galvatron demands a huge planet do his bidding just because he's got a shiny necklace. But you get the idea. I love the G1 version of the character, so it was nice to see him get the spotlight here. Guido Guidi's design for him, as well as the ones he provided for Hound and Sideswipe, strike a pleasing blend between G1 fidelity and new additions. They certainly lean towards the G1 cartoon more than, say, E.J. Su or Nick Roche's redesigns, but there are enough updated touches here that it all just looks really good, in my opinion. I mentioned this in the Hearts of Steel video, but I feel like Guidi is a Transformers artist that is heavily operating within the parameters of the G1 cartoon style. And while he does a great job at faithfully reproducing the best that aesthetic has to offer, he's also really good at redesigning characters, and I think his work on Hearts of Steel and Spotlight Galvatron show that off quite well. And while we're on the topic of this particular spotlight, I think it's worth talking about some of the character-related choices here. There are some minor things here that I like, such as the inclusion of some G2 characters like Leadfoot, Scram, and Road Rocket, characters I don't have that much experience with other than some of the comics, but there are some more substantial things to talk about as well, one of which is the dynamic between Sideswipe and Hound. To say it's an uneasy or turbulent dynamic would be an understatement. And I don't think there's anything particularly egregious about Hound's behavior in this issue, so the conflict between these two really boils down to Sideswipe's personality, and I think that's a fun little touch. I'm a big fan of how Furman wrote the character for this portion of the IDW continuity. He's hot-headed and impulsive, but somehow manages to feel very different than Hot Rod, the other hot-headed and impulsive Autobot. IDW Sideswipe is a guy that wants to crack skulls and be in the thick of the action, and that's all by his own admission in the text here. He's surly, abrasive, and it's clear that he has no interest in being a part of Hound's unit, and has no qualms about making his displeasure known again and again, no matter what kind of trouble it lands him in. That results in some humorous moments both here and in upcoming issues, with the highlight for me being when Sideswipe drops Galvatron with a lethal shot to the head, despite Hound's direct orders to take him alive, and Sideswipe's response to Hound's anger is to dismissively tell his superior officer to get out of his face. I don't know, I've always just been amused by that line. Gets me every time I read it. And of course, there's Galvatron himself, and there's some interesting stuff that Furman did with the character this time around. There's a lot in here that recalls Galvatron from the animated movie, him being a herald or an emissary, contemptuously serving a master with ambitions for eventually taking control of his own destiny. In some ways, this may have been Furman toying with fan expectations at the time, prompting questions of whether or not Unicron was being introduced, or if there were time travel shenanigans happening, like in the Marvel Comics years. It quickly became clear that Furman was reinventing this character to a degree that was unprecedented at this time in the continuity, though that would soon become a much more common practice. Most of the characters Furman worked on up to this point were given a makeover in some way, but none as drastic as Galvatron. While there are aspects of G1 Galvatron's character here that seem familiar, the entire character's existence has been reimagined for this continuity. The big thing being that he's not connected to Megatron in any way. He's not a future version of Megatron. He wasn't created from Megatron. None of that. This issue was the first instance that I encountered Galvatron as a separate entity, a full character character unto himself rather than a reformatted Megatron. And rather than being a character introduced in the far-flung future of 2005, IDW Galvatron is an ancient Cybertronian. Much later down the road, we'll learn that he's even older than it seems in this Spotlight issue, but that'll be for another video. The point is, he has an entirely new backstory involving the first Ark and the Dead Universe, and entirely new allegiances as well, which makes sense considering he and the rest of the crew vanished before the Decepticons were even founded. Interestingly enough, Galvatron does retain some of that rebelliousness from the '86 animated movie, though the whole thing about leaving most of the Autobots alive as an act of resistance is a bit of a flimsy contrivance, but I guess it ultimately gets the job done, establishing what it needs to establish about the character while leaving Sideswipe, Hound, and the others alive for future issues, so I guess it's fine. While we're talking about characters, let's jump over to Spotlight Optimus Prime, where we get some really cool stuff with Omega Supreme and the Monstructor 6. I like how Furman is keeping an aspect of Omega Supreme's G1 cartoon fictional history intact here, which is that he was, in terms of the in-universe chronology, the first Autobot to throw down with the first Combiner in Cybertron's distant past. Obviously in the cartoon that was Devastator, whereas here it's Monstructor. And that link will further be explored and expanded on by John Barber in Phase 2 by looping in the destruction of Crystal City. And while we're on the subject of Phase 2 and retcons, there are things in this Spotlight issue that are not integrated into the longer form of the continuity quite as well as you would hope. For example, Optimus has his concept of the Prime lineage tarnished as being corrupt in this issue. However, when you look at events chronologically for the entire continuity, he would have known they were corrupt much earlier, having had first-hand experience with that after opposing Zeta Prime's regime in Autocracy, as well as knowing about Sentinel Prime's corruption during Shadowplay and Elegant Chaos. I suppose you could hand-wave some of that stuff away somewhat based on a line in Autocracy where Optimus says that he served a line of primes that grew increasingly oppressive, where maybe he kind of assumed earlier primes would be less corrupt. But that also feeds into what I think is potentially another more egregious continuity error in Primacy number 3, where Omega Supreme tells Optimus Prime that Nova was corrupt. I'm sure he doesn't go into specifics, but when you look at the information in chronological order, Optimus had more than enough reasons to be soured on the lineage of primes before this issue. Of course, that's all if you look at it chronologically. What it boils down to is that this issue was published first, and Simon Furman obviously had different ideas in mind than the creative teams that would follow. And the 05 continuity did some pretty impressive retconning to make everything in the run gel together as much as possible, but there are still some continuity hiccups that slip through, and I think this is one of them. And it's admittedly a really minor thing. I don't think it's a big deal at all. It's just something that I think is worth pointing out. But it is cool that Nova Prime and the pictured but unnamed Sentinel Prime were included in the Prime lineage in this Spotlight, as they both have their roots from the G1 days, where Sentinel was the direct predecessor to Optimus. Something that appears to have been the intention here as well, though it's hard to say for certain. Going by this image, at least, it seems plausible, but plans started changing as the timeline went on, and new creative teams ended up interjecting Nominus Prime between Nova and Sentinel, and also inserting Zeta Prime between the line of succession between Sentinel and Optimus. But enough about the primes, let's talk about the big reveal here, Monstructor. I think it's extremely cool that Monstructor was chosen for the Combiner here. I used to have most of these guys as a kid. I don't remember exactly, but I feel like I might have had all of them. The Pretender shells, at least, I'm pretty sure I had all of them, though I was definitely missing some pieces and probably one or two of the inner core robots. I don't know. I just know I couldn't form Monstructor, and I'll always be eternally bummed about it. But nevertheless, I have a serious soft spot for this team because of that nostalgic connection. And I also appreciate that they're kind of the odd ones out when it comes to combiners. Monstructor is likely not the first name that comes to mind when you think about G1 combiners. And so there's a certain charm there with the more unfamiliar and less popular team. I think the Pretender shells were very cool looking, definitely a product of their time. Ice Pick and Scowl in particular were my favorite shells from the group. I like the color scheme for the Inner Robot team, and the box art made them look pretty cool. Though I have to say that didn't really translate to the robot or alt modes of the toys very well. Yeah, they were maybe not the best toys, but like I said, I have a fair amount of nostalgic affinity towards them, and there's just something about those lesser known characters that I appreciate. So to see them given new life and focus here continues to be something I love about the IDW continuity. Compare the first appearance of the Pretender monsters to the first appearance of the Terrorcons in Spotlight 6-Shot. It's a massive difference. Whereas the Terrorcon's appearance was superfluous, unexciting, and pretty close to pointless, the Pretender monsters absolutely steal the show here. Well, Monstructor steals the show, to be precise, and maybe that's part of why they stand out more. But it's not like the Pretender monsters or Monstructor are given super deep characterizations or character arcs. They're just used really well. I think there's a spectacle element to combiners more than anything else, and Furman nails that aspect. I mean, Optimus has a showdown with Monstructor on a comet. And if that's not spectacle, I don't know what is. Figueroa's redesigns for the 6 individual robots are fine. I don't know. I actually prefer the box art for the individuals here, but he absolutely outdid himself with the design for Monstructor. The combined form just looks awesome here. From the little set of extra arms, to the colors, to the newly designed skull head. While I may not feel the same about Figueroa's designs for the individuals, his take on Monstructor is vastly better than the G1 design, in my opinion, and is pretty much my go-to look when I think of the character. It's always fun to see how different artists approach these characters or telling a story with these characters in it. And it's easier to compare and contrast when you have these issues as part of a collection. All of the art is extremely strong in this batch of spotlights, each in its own way. While we've seen 3 of the spotlight artists before, this is the first time Marcelo Matera contributed interior art for the IDW continuity with Spotlight Soundwave. Matera has been involved with the brand for quite a while now. If you've purchased a Transformers toy over the last 20 years, there's a non-zero chance you've seen some of the art he's provided for the packaging. And that number goes far beyond non-zero if you've bought or have even seen any of the recent Studio Series 86 line, as he's been heavily involved with the box art for those figures. He's a prolific artist and designer, and I could probably spend the entire video going over the sheer number of things he's worked on, but as far as comics go, it's a slightly different story. While he produced a good amount of covers for IDW's Transformers comics over the years, interior art from this guy is somewhat more sparse, unfortunately. I say unfortunately, but I'm sure the workload and pay for his other work is much better than doing interiors for comics. But I selfishly would have liked to see him do more comics, as I think he's an excellent storyteller. His style is in the Dreamwave camp, with boxy, blocky robots in the G1 style, but with an emphasis on extra line work and added detail. There are plenty of examples I could point to, and I think a lot of the images shown already illustrate it just fine, but I do want to draw attention to this panel of Bludgeon's hand. Admittedly, not the most exciting thing ever, but look at the amount of detail Marcelo packed in here. From the blocky segmentation of the different parts of the hand, to the little lines placed at the tip of each finger, to the lines and scratches denoting the wear and tear on Bludgeon's poorly maintained frame. Even these little wires have way more detail than they need to. He puts a lot of effort into making the mechanical stuff in this issue look cool, and I always appreciate seeing those little touches. I think it's readily apparent how nice the art is across these 4 issues, but there is something a little less glamorous and maybe a little less apparent that I want to touch on with the art in this collection, and it has to do with the layouts. If you remember in my Stormbringer video, I brought up how much I liked how the layouts communicated the transitions between the story set in the present and the story set in flashback, with the panel borders for the present being what you'd expect, primarily straight lines, whereas the flashback panel borders become jagged and rough. Along with that, the gutters, typically filled with a solid color for the present day, begin to streak and dissolve to white for the flashbacks. The overall colors for the images within the panels of Stormbringer were also somewhat faded to further distinguish past from present. Considering that Spotlight Optimus Prime reunites Don Figueroa and Josh Bertram, it's perhaps no surprise that the same method is used for distinguishing present events from past ones. We see the same transition from straight panel borders to jagged ones, and the red gutter present throughout the entire Spotlight issue gives way to white gutters for flashbacks, and back again to red when returning to the present. The faded colors for the art within the panels doesn't seem to make the jump from Stormbringer to Spotlight Optimus, at least to my eye, but the color work for the past does seem subtly different than that set in the present, but I can't quite put my finger on why to the extent that I wonder if I'm imagining it. Anyway, looking at this collection in one go means we can see how different artists and colorists approached the same task of delineating past and present, and how they accomplished it in unique, individual ways. Spotlight Soundwave approaches this in a similar fashion to Stormbringer, with the flashback sequences having rougher, jagged panel borders and faded color work by Rob Ruffalo, though the fade is a bit more intense, producing an almost monochromatic effect with an abundance of this purple-gray color, with splotches of other colors thrown in sparingly. It's certainly a cool effect, but that's not all there is to it. In addition, there's this glow effect applied to the inner edges of the panels, though interestingly enough, on this page with Megatron, it's only applied to the outer edges of the page, rather than all of the panels in subsequent pages. And there's one more thing that runs through the flashback sequence here, but is most apparent on this page with Megatron. The shadows have a rougher, sketch-like quality to them that isn't present elsewhere in the book. And while I'm certainly no expert here, the texture seems more like pencil than ink. But I fully admit I could be wrong about that. Regardless, all of these different components help give this section a distinct flair and make it instantly clear that we're not in the present day. Spotlight Galvatron takes a different angle for his flashback sequences, literally in fact, by rounding off the sharp corners of the panels for the sequences involving Galvatron's memories. And I think the effect is fairly clear when we see it used on the two-page spread of the Ark and the subsequent page showing Galvatron sabotaging the journey. But in case there's any doubt, the effect becomes most obvious on the last page when we have panels from both the past and present together on a single page. And I'm going to get to Spotlight Cup in a moment because it's a little different, but before I do, there's a bit more to say about the panel borders moving away from the past and present dichotomy. There are a few things that stand out to me here that I think are pretty cool and provide some visual interest. First of all, while we're on Spotlight Galvatron, the entire book features an inversion of the typical coloration for panel borders and gutters, with the gutters being black instead of white and the borders being white instead of black. IDW wasn't making use of a lot of white gutter space during this time in Transformers comics, so they did use black for the gutters with some regularity, but they also relied on solid colors or gradients, so there was more variety in other books than there was in this one. And the white panel borders set against the stark black backgrounds of Spotlight Galvatron are extremely unique. There's not much in the 05 continuity that mimicked this up to this point, giving the whole thing a very different feel, in my opinion. And in Spotlight Soundwave, the borders are used for action effects that I think really hammers home the intensity of whatever action is being shown, like here with Soundwave launching his missiles, or this one, where Iguana shoots Soundwave with Shockwave's experimental weapon, the ferocity and significance of the action being underscored by the rough border and white background that switches back to black with the very next panel. The lead up to that attack is worth drawing attention to as well. During the brief pause that's almost like a gunslinger duel from a western, the panel width for this cascading series of panels becomes shorter and shorter, which seems to convey that the time for Soundwave to act is running out. The shrinking panels and fragmented wordless images working together to intensify the frantic pace at which he hatches and enacts his desperate last-ditch effort during that brief span of time before Iguanus can pull the trigger. And there's a pretty cool, though maybe less exciting effect where an extremely jagged border is used to quickly and clearly establish that Laserbeak is transmitting his recordings from Bludgeon's base to the workers' lodgings where Soundwave is located. And there's also an interesting technique used in Spotlight Optimus when the action shifts over to the Comet, Up until that point, when Figueroa would use larger panels surrounded by smaller ones, the larger panels would have clearly visible panel lines, even if there were smaller panels stacked on top. Once we hit the Comet section, though, the panel borders for those larger panels are gone, replaced by an almost vignette effect, where the image fades into the red of the gutters. I'm not sure what the intent was exactly, but it does seem intentional. And it's an interesting effect anyway, kind of highlighting the unstable and brightly glowing setting of the Comet. But let's switch over to Spotlight Cup for a bit, because there are some similar devices being used. Now, I know I'm not the first person to draw attention to this because it's on the TF Wiki page for the issue, but let's see if I can add a little bit to what's already out there. The rough panel borders as well as the heavily inked lines denote Cup's delusional state, whereas cleaner lines and more subtle shading are used for everything taking place in reality. And we see that for the first time when we follow Siren back to Arc 17. In a neat little transitional device, the panel borders stabilize into straight lines pretty much immediately in this sequence, and I think you can pretty clearly see the different approaches to inking and shading when the images are side by side like this. These stylistic divisions lead to some cool stuff at the end, where the real world starts to intrude on Cup's psychosis. The first example is where we see Springer's holographic projection, rendered for the first time in this issue with clarity and clean lines that stands out compared to the distorted ghost version that we'd seen previously, and that we'd get one more little glimpse of later on. And we see it again when Trailbreaker finds Cup. I love this page because beyond placing reality and delusion side by side, it's a division of comic art styles that I think works on multiple levels. Trailbreaker is rendered in such a way here that makes him look right at home in a modern comic, very much in line with the shading and inking practices IDW had been employing up to this point. Whereas Cup seems to be inked and shaded in a way that's torn right out of an older style of comics. One might even say it's straight from the Marvel Comics era, with heavily inked lines and dramatic, pure black shadows. This ends up playing into the idea of Cup as the old style of Cybertronian in an amusingly meta sort of way. At least that's how I see it. I could be way off base here. I admit that was a lot said about something that is relatively minor in terms of the form of comics, and it's not necessarily anything new or unusual. I mean, I've been rereading the Outback era of Uncanny X-Men recently, and I was on issue number 233 a few days ago, and in that story, the panel borders were modified to separate the waking world from Madeline Pryor's dream. And although specific examples elude me at the moment, I'm positive the technique goes back even further than that. It was just the most recent example that I ran into it. I bring it up in these videos not because it's groundbreaking, but because I'm fascinated by the nuts and bolts of how this stuff works and the choices the creative teams make in order to play with conventions. And I think it's worth drawing attention to because I think it's part of what makes the medium of comics as special as it is. Even though stuff like layouts, panel borders, and the gutters are small and subtle to the point where we as readers might not consciously notice them, I think on some subconscious level we do. And these formal elements subtly change how the story comes across, and I think it's interesting to see how different artists tackle the same challenges. That's just how I feel about it anyway. You may disagree, and that's okay. I'd like to hear your thoughts, as well as any thoughts you have on these 4 Spotlight issues, so drop me a comment, tell me what you like or don't like about these issues, or which one is your favorite of the bunch. I think it might be Spotlight Optimus Prime for me, but I don't know. I also really like Spotlight Galvatron. Can't really decide between those two. Anyway, check out my other videos on the IDW continuity if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like what I'm doing here. As always, thank you for watching this. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Take care.